Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. How many of you are first-year students new to here? Oh wow, that's great. Welcome to university life. I just kind of thought maybe the room being full was due down to sort of over-enthusiasm from freshers. So it's nice to have a mix. All right. I wanted to talk a little bit about. I know you're not all freshers. I know some of you are a bit older than that. I want to talk a bit about the role of business in the upcoming climate negotiations in Paris, what it is, and then I'd like to have a bit of a discussion about whether it's good or bad and how to kind of navigate that. So I'll talk a little bit about how businesses come to have more of a central role in the multilateral process. And then I will explain a little bit about what the organisation that I manage does, or the coalition of organisations. And I'll illustrate some of the positive things that I think business is doing to influence policy. But then I want to pose sort of 6 dilemmas of actual things which are happening and ask you to tell me what you think is good and what you think is maybe dodgy about those, to try and engage critical faculty. So I'm glad it's full, so you can't all hide at the back, but I'll be expecting participation from the back row as well as the front row. And then I'll just end with just some reflections on where we're at now and what needs to happen in the next 5 years, and then hopefully we'll still have some time for questions. I would say, though, if at any point I say anything that you really don't understand or you radically disagree with and you want to interrupt, feel free to do that. I'd rather you did that than just spend 45 minutes stewing and waiting for a question at the end. So can I just check, how many of you, I'm going to ask you, I want to know, how many of you feel fairly well informed about climate change? Particularly climate change diplomacy and politics and policy? About half of you. How many feel you know business reasonably well? Less of you. So how many of you know neither climate change nor business? Okay, so there's a couple of honest people. Yes, thank you. And how many of you feel that you've got a pretty good understanding of business and climate change? Okay, so only a few. So this is a kind of nexus that I think is important. So again, if I assume some knowledge of business and use some language you don't understand because you're more on the climate science side, or vice versa, please ask. There's a lot of jargon in both fields, and I spend most of my time working with people in that nexus. So there's one of the organisations that's one of the partners of Women in Business is called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the 5-letter acronym WBCSD, and they run a programme of technological collaborations with the UN's Sustainable Development Solutions Network and the International Energy Agency. So sometimes they talk about WBCSD stroke SDSN stroke IEA's LCTPI program. So you can very quickly get lost in a whole sea of acronyms. So I'll try to avoid that, but just shout if I go too fast on something. So let me start by saying a little bit about Paris and the role of business in Paris. So my background's in industry, and I started working in this nexus of business and climate policy and investors about 8 years ago. And my first exposure to the multilateral process, the United Nations process, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process, was in Copenhagen in 2009, which many of you will remember was the last great hope for a breakthrough treaty. And I'd never been to anything to do with the UN before. I'd spent all my life in the private sector. And I turned up in Copenhagen with all my papers and accreditations, and I spent 8 hours in sub-zero temperatures waiting to get into the event and couldn't get in. And it was like there was about 1,000 of us waiting outside. There were TV cameras filming us. There were people writing notes and pushing them up against the railing saying, "Haven't eaten since breakfast, and please get us some water." It was like a sort of dystopian film, where society breaks down. It was a joke, really. And it was like, oh my God, this is the organisation that's supposed to be saving the world. That's kind of worrying. So I decided I wasn't going to waste any more time and went down the road where there was a side event with businesses and legislators from some of the states and provinces around the world. And it was a really rich debate, but there were none of the negotiators there. It wasn't part of the process. Things have changed a lot since then. So historically, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has been negotiated by the parties. The COP21 is the conference of the parties. There are 196 of them. It sometimes goes up and down a bit. And they all have to agree every comma, every bracket, every word. That's a very high bar to negotiate something. There's very, very few governmental processes where that degree of consensus is required. And in Copenhagen, that process failed to deliver to the expectations of the world. So there was a kind of collective mourning and wailing and bemoaning the failure of the process. Actually, some good things came out of it, but it didn't deliver this top-down treaty where every country in the world signed up to binding commitments that were negotiated by 196 countries. And to simplify, two big things have changed since then. One, rather than try and negotiate everything top-down, there's been a recognition that sovereign states don't do that kind of negotiation very well. Some of them more than others. I mean, the United States famously doesn't sign up to a lot of international treaties. So if that's your premise, that we're all going to negotiate top-down and agree, you're kind of planning for failure. So the first big change is to recognise that getting sovereign states on board with a collective treaty, but where they made individual commitments that weren't all negotiated by everyone else, to try and get away from some of the horse trading. There's been a huge breakthrough. So so now, this time around, what's actually being negotiated is quite minimalist. And a lot of the action is with the sovereign states all making their own commitments and their own plans, which are called intended nationally determined contributions. So they're the proposed plans for countries to reduce their emissions in the period 2020 to 2030. So those are all being submitted now. There's about 150 being submitted out of 196, covering about 85% of the world's emissions. So that's a huge change, right? Which has actually meant that instead of it being a big sort of developed world must move, developing world asking for more ambition and for more technology transfer and more funding, it's become more of a collective response to the world's biggest collective action problem. There are plenty of challenges even within that reduced framing. The other big difference happened at two conferences of the parties ago, so COP19 in Warsaw, where the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, called a meeting of a group of us, several of us working for NGOs working with business. I was the Executive Director at CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project then, and a group of CEOs who happened to be there. And he basically said, we all know that business is going to have to play a huge role in delivering the solutions to climate change. It's going to be massively, disruptively impacted for good or for real, but it's going to have to be part of the solution. We've got to find a way to bring the voice of business into the process, not into the legal multilateral process. I don't want you to think that business is now negotiating with governments. That's not happening. But inside in Paris in December, there'll be the blue zone, the security zone where the actual negotiation takes place. And this year, for the first time, businesses will be inside that zone. There'll be a series of business events co-run with the UN system to talk about what business is doing and what business can do. So this is quite a radical breakthrough, and it's not just businesses. It's broader than that. It's so-called non-state actors. There's a recognition that not just national governments, but sub-national governments can have a huge role to play. And so, if you keep some of you will already know this, but if you keep your eye out for what some of the cities are doing and what some of the states are doing, then in many cases they're able to be more innovative with new policy, bolder with policy than their federal government. So the case in point would be Canada, where you've got a very slow federal government with regards to bold action on climate change, but 4 of the main provinces covering most of the GDP have implemented carbon prices and have got very either cap and trade or taxes, and have got very ambitious emissions reduction targets. So in a way that the provincial ambition, because they have jurisdiction over energy, transport, and quite a lot of fiscal measures, trumps the federal. And in the States, of course, you've got California, which, if it was independent, would be the 8th biggest economy in the world, which has got probably one of the most climate ambitious governors in the world. So the idea of getting those voices in the room is about, A, showing negotiators what's possible. Most negotiators are actually not very senior often, for most of the part. They're kind of technocrats in an environmental ministry often. I mean, the ministers will come in at the end, but a lot of the heavy lifting is done by people who are basically civil servants. So they don't have experience of business, they don't have experience of executive power. unlike mayors, governors, CEOs, who have experience of both of those. And they've often been in the system for about 20 years, right? So, and it's been quite adversarial, and it's been north versus south, developed versus developing, and it's been it hasn't been about collective response to collective action necessarily. So they're often a bit stuck. And in particular with regards to business, they often believe the mantra, which I think is taught to all diplomats wherever they get educated, that all business resists all regulation always. And that's not surprising that people think that, because if we look at the history of business engagement in climate change, it's been totally dominated by heavy emitting incumbents who do spread that kind of fear, uncertainty and doubt, which makes regulators who know that part of the reason they get to stay in power is that their economy thrives, which means that they are not rejected by the business community, are very sensitive to. So this year in Paris, the French presidency of the COP, of the Conference of the Parties, are talking about 4 pillars of the Paris Alliance. So instead of just talking about the UNFCCC negotiated texts, they say there are 4 things that will come out of Paris. So this is really important. It's especially important with regards to the response to Paris, because if you just look at Pillar 1, which is the text which will be negotiated, it won't say that much. It will say that there'll be a restatement of the international commitment to stay within 2 degrees. It may be restated to a decarbonisation or a net zero well before the end of the century, but it'll be largely restated. And there'll be something about this process of the INDCs, these national determined contributions, and the regularity with which they need to be reviewed, which will be clear. And then a lot of it will be largely procedural. So the real rubber hits the road with these nationally determined contributions and the way they interact with, so that's Pillar 2 is the nationally determined contributions. Pillar 3 is a key political element. It was a promise that was made in Copenhagen by the developed nations to provide $100 billion of climate finance to the developing countries per year by 2020. That actually, the amount of money that needs to be invested in climate smart infrastructure is more like $6 trillion a year. So much, much bigger quantum. That's why I say it's a political expedient, that because that was a promise made by the global north to the global south, if that's not delivered in Paris, and we've just had the World Bank meetings in Peru which have demonstrated quite a lot of progress towards that, but if that 100 billion, if there's a sense from the developing countries that that promise isn't going to be delivered on, then politically they will lose a lot of faith in the overall process. So when you hear about this 3rd pillar of finance, it's not actually the total flow of investment which needs to go into a low carbon infrastructure, which will largely be made in the next 15 years because infrastructure investments are very long term and therefore get locked in. If you imagine building a coal-fired power station today locks in heavy emissions for 40, maybe even 50 years. So it's the decisions on infrastructure in the next 15 years that are really key. But so that 100 billion is as I say, really political. And then there's the 4th pillar, the so-called Lima, because that was where the last COP took place in Peru, the Lima Paris Action Agenda, which is this invitation to states and regions, cities and businesses to individually and collaboratively come up with commitments that they can then be held accountable to act on climate change. And that's where I'm very involved. So I'm at this kind of interesting ringside seat now with the role I play. I'm on Christiana Figueres' Strategic Advisory Council, work closely with the Secretary General's team and the French government. That's interesting, having spent most of my career in business and then working with a business stroke investor NGO to now be working quite closely with government to realise that all organisations are kind of dysfunctional in their own way, right? None more so than the United Nations, which is like a weird collection of small NGOs fighting for funding and reputation. That's a book. One of my closest friends and previous colleagues is now acting as strategic advisor to Christiana Figueres. So there's a lot of unrepeatable stories about some of the things which politicians say. So because they're unrepeatable, I won't repeat them. So let me dive then a little bit into this 4th pillar and the role of business. And so let me describe a little bit the work that We Mean Business does. So We Mean Business is a coalition initially of 7 organisations. You'll have heard of some of them, like the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, the Climate Group, the Carbon Disclosure Project, the B Team, which is a group of global elders, and Ceres and BSR in the States. And now we have about another 20 partners. And we formed this coalition about 2 years ago because we decided that, if you like, the incumbent powers, those who don't want action on climate change, were very well funded, very well coordinated, and we're kind of winning the media battle. In fact, we're still sort of waiting to see what's going to happen. It's like 2 months to go, and we don't know what trick's going to be pulled by some of the very well funded campaigns which go on quietly in the background, at kind of arm's length from big oil. And we decided that all of these great organisations were doing really good work, but were kind of fragmented and even competing a little bit. So there would be like 3 initiatives on renewable energy procurement. And so for the business world, it would be kind of messy. Like, so there's the climate group doing this, and CDP doing that, and BSR doing that. And so to build any sense of movement and momentum at scale was very difficult. So we came together 2 years ago, and what we're basically trying to do is I sometimes describe it as a left-hand, right-hand punch combination. So we're trying overtly to influence in the positive direction international and national climate policy, but to do that through the tool of business leadership. So we basically believe that the era of businesses saying things like, and there's been plenty of communiques and statements like, we the undersigned understand that climate is a real threat, recognise that business has a huge role to play, and commit to playing our part, and we want policymakers to do X, Y, and Z. So, a kind of nice, supportive statement. It's hard to get businesses to sign up for things like that, but doesn't make any commitments which a business can be held accountable to. And importantly, particularly in a very legalistic regime like in the States, for a CEO of a listed company to make a statement like, we will reduce our emissions by 30% by 2030, or we will procure 100% renewable energy by 2025. It's important for those of you who don't understand the amount of scrutiny that goes onto what CEOs say in that kind of environment. That statement is a compliance statement with the Securities and Exchange Commission. A CEO can't just say something like that and then forget about it. That's then on record. It's a signal to investors of an intent to act, which at any time can be a request for disclosure of the thinking and the plans behind that can be requested and expected to be divulged. So it's not a sort of thing that a CEO can do as a pet project or as a kind of hope, like maybe we'll be able to do it, or lots of other people seem to be able to do it, so I'll just do it. It's not sort of I'll just click a button or sign a letter. So that's one of the reasons why historically there's been a lot of these sort of generally supportive statements, but very little real hard long-term commitments from business. So we decided that this is the time to change that. Yeah. Yeah, it would. Yeah. So that's the sort of thing that you should be on the lookout for, are people saying we will, or we commit to, or we plan to, or we're exploring, or we might, or we'd like to, or we have an aspirational goal. It's not that we intend to. I mean, you might have to ask a lawyer about intent, how strong the word intend implies. But you should look out and be skeptical about that language, because if it's a very clear commitment, then it's a very clear commitment. If it's vague, it may be because people are trying to send a nice signal, but not really leave themselves on the hook.
Well, what happens if they don't do it?
Lawsuit, loss of job, loss of reputation, dive of share price. Who wants to work for Volkswagen here? Right, So just to say, those statements matter, but you're right. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to raise the bar of corporate ambition in 2 ways. One, making it more long-term, because most corporate commitments on climate change tend to be quite short-term. Maybe less than 5 years. Right? There's not a lot historically of businesses have made commitments to reduce their emissions over a 20 or 30-year time frame. That's outside the tenure of the average CEO, so it's understandable, right? But that is the time frame we have to be dealing with. The other thing that we're trying to do is make sure that they're real commitments. I'll give you one example. There's a lot of good work being done on trying to eliminate unsustainable practices in this procurement of the so-called 4 big deforestation commodities. So palm oil, soy, beef, and timber, if unsustainably procured, can lead to massive destruction of rainforests. Okay, so that's bad. I mean, it's bad for all sorts of reasons. Not the big spike in CO2 emissions, but also big biodiversity habitat loss, etc., etc. So there's the Consumer Goods Forum, which is the large trade body of the major retailers and consumer goods companies, has made a commitment as a body to end the unsustainable sourcing of those four commodities by 2020. 400 companies in that body. So does that mean, it's back to the point about intent or language, does that mean that those 400 companies have publicly committed to that practice? No. There's no binding way in which the Sustainability Council of the Consumer Goods Forum can come to an agreement which forces its members to act. So that's a kind of a loose commitment, and what we're trying to do is say, okay, where are the actual public statements of commitment from those 400 companies? In fact, it might only be about 200 that are relevant because the rest of them they don't all have forest commodities in their supply chain. So far, we've got 27 companies to publicly make that commitment. So it's about trying to close that wiggle room gap to make sure that the commitments are real, on the record, and that companies can be held accountable to them.
What do you think that companies always have to, for example, make sure their share price stays high? So, for example, they may not be able to afford investing in more renewable or the environmental friendly technology because their shareholders will tell on it or there's a comment.
Well, first of all, state your source. Where's that argument come from?
No, but I'm just wondering. I mean, what I'm getting at is what is the role that private sector can play in actually reaching some of the targets that the world is trying to get to in Paris now,
Yeah.
compared to before?
Yeah.
And how does that whole dynamic work? Because obviously private sector companies need to be profitable all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe that's like sort of both sides of the thing that what happens at some point, they can balance that thing and then they end up cheating. So how
Yeah. So good question. So there's a couple of things there. One other thing which has changed, two things which have changed a lot since Copenhagen. One is technologies advanced massively in renewables. Right, so we now have a significant number of companies committing to procuring 100% of their electricity from renewable energy. And some of them have already done it. And they could do that because actually the CFOs like that, because they enter into a long-term power purchase agreement. It gives them a guaranteed power price, no volatility risk, which they have to hedge against, and it gives them a good price, and in particular it gives them a hedge against what they might think is a risk of rising power prices. So that'd be one example where technology has moved to the point where that decision is much easier to make now than 5 years ago. Because 5 years ago it would have been a kind of bold loss-making decision, whereas now it can be a really good financial decision. The other thing that's moved on, I think, is the sophistication of civil society in engaging in some of these issues, and therefore the reputational risk. So to the palm oil example, I don't know if any of you remember I think it's a Greenpeace ad of someone eating a Kit Kat. Anyone see that one? YouTube it. It's very effective, and the Kit Kat basically turns out to be like an orangutan's finger. So somebody eats a Kit Kat and then there's sort of orangutan blood on their face. It's pretty nasty, right? Because it was basically Nestle are using unsustainable palm oil, which is driving deforestation in Sumatra, which is killing orangutans. So, for example, last year Procter & Gamble had Greenpeace hanging banners on their Cincinnati headquarters because they hadn't committed to eliminating unsustainable palm oil from their supply chains, whereas Nestle and Unilever and everyone else had. So that sophistication of civil society means that the downside, especially for consumer good companies, is quite high, and the move of technology means that the cost argument is not so strong or is gone. That we'll talk about oil and gas companies in a minute, where it's hard to see the upside, right? Yeah.
Can I ask you how big a problem you see for what we're trying to achieve are these big global trade deals going on just now, like TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and TTIP, with the United States and the EU, which organizations like Warren Wong say that it's locking in business as usual, which isn't going to help achieve some of these points.
I'll be really honest, I don't know. That's not a very good answer, but what do you have? I mean, can you perhaps you could expand on that and say in what way that might be good or bad?
Well, the critics are saying that some are locking in like fossil fuel use and long into the future.
Because how? By what mechanism is it locking it in?
It's a very secretive process, these deals, so there's not very much information comes out.
Right, so that's just unless there's an argument, I can't, unless there's a sort of proposed mechanism for locking, then that's just we don't like the deal. I mean, that's not helpful, is it? So next time, are you a member of War on Want? No, somebody tell them to explain because we need to know the mechanisms. This is a really important point about the role of civil society. So let me jump forward to There are some. This matters because Paris. I'm jumping around, but that's fine because it helps if it sort of follows some of your thinking. So in some ways, Paris is already a success, right? Because we've got 150 countries have made bolder commitments now than a year ago, right? In some ways, it's not a success because those commitments, when you add them together, don't get us onto a track which would keep us under 2 degrees. The various estimates are between sort of 2.7 and 3.5 degrees. And if that gets locked in now and then we don't review it until 2025, then we'll have to decarbonise at such a fast rate that we might give up. This brings me to the role of civil society, because there are some members of civil society who are getting ready to basically boycott Paris and describe it as a disaster and a failure because it hasn't got us onto a 2-degree track. And I question how helpful that is, and I'll illustrate it with one example. In Davos in February this year, this group, the B team, so 15 global leaders, Mohammed Yunus, Richard Branson, Paul Polman, and another 11 others, Jochen Zeitz from Puma, had a lecture from Jochen Rockström, the Swedish Earth system scientist, about the planetary boundaries idea. This idea that there are 9 planetary boundaries. One of them is our ability to manage the climate, or the climate's ability to absorb CO2, or the Earth system's ability to absorb CO2. And that we're over on the biodiversity one and the water one, and we're very close to the climate one. And he explained some of the mathematics of the science. You know, with a 2-degree target is actually a carbon budget target to leave us to have a 66% chance of staying under 2 degrees. You know, the Earth system's massively non-linear. No one really understands it well enough to say that if we stay within this carbon budget, then we will stay under 2 degrees. Even at that, on that trajectory, we have a risk of runaway climate change. So he explained this to these guys, and they basically immediately said, we've got to do something about this. That the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which pulls all the climate science together every few years, has basically said that this track will give us a 66% chance of staying within 2 degrees. And they basically said, that's a nightmare, like a 34% chance of going over 2 degrees with all the damage that would result in socially and economically. So they immediately came out and said, we call on governments to set a target of net zero emissions by 2050. Whereas the IPCC says net zero emissions well before the end of the century, so 25, 30 years later. So you've got a group of global business leaders come out with this, and Mary Robinson's one of them. So it was net zero by 2050, the climate justice way, because that's her big thing. It's all about, let's make sure that the transition doesn't leave the poor behind or create more poverty, that it's about access to energy as well as decarbonisation of energy. And the immediate response, so you would think that if you were fighting for energy access and bold policy on climate change, that anyone would welcome that as a very strong signal from some very powerful, very respected leaders to the world's governments who listen to those kind of people. You know, power listens to power. You would think that would be welcomed, and then maybe there'll be some footnotes about some concerns about the track. ActionAid only response was to say, we completely reject this. This is appalling, and it would imply billions of starving people in sub-Saharan Africa, because it would set up a catastrophic conflict between biosequestration of carbon in sub-Saharan soils and the production of food for sub-Saharan people. So the role of civil society, just as we should be careful about some of the language which business uses to see whether they're trying to play a game or pretend to act, I think we should be careful. My fear is that some civil society are locked into a mindset which says, we are the ones on the side of good, and we must criticise government and businesses on the side of evil, right? So there's sometimes a knee-jerk reaction, and we all have our knee-jerk reactions, right? That's not particularly a thing about civil society being bad and business and governments being good. Everyone has their own knee-jerk reactions. So that's one that I worry about. Is that so I engage with ActionAid to say, can you explain why you have a concern? There's a very valid concern about the net part of net zero, because they think it might lead to a kind of a runaway offsetting mechanism, which does lead to that problem. And it's a valid concern, but I think it's not even half empty, half full. It's sort of 10% empty, 90% full, in terms of the power of such a political signal. So let me just quickly come back to we mean business. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to give a voice to what we think is the silent majority of businesses who actually understand the science, know that macroeconomically the cost of inaction will be much higher than the cost of action, therefore that it will be worse for business in the long run. And in many businesses, and I work a lot with Unilever, they see hundreds of millions of dollars of damages right now because of increased levels of severe weather disrupting their supply chains. So it's a present danger and risk for many companies now. So they know that macroeconomically we need to address this. And they know from work like the report of the New Climate Economy, Better Growth, Better Climate, which was issued a year ago, that, as I say, the cost of inaction is less than the cost of action. But as I say, that those group of businesses, because they don't stand to directly lose from, say, a carbon price or higher fuel efficiency standards, have historically been silent. They've been getting on with other aspects of the business, whereas that much smaller group of companies who do stand to directly lose, to the point about whether it's a win for everybody, have been much more vocal. So we're trying to give much more voice to those commitments. Let me give you 4 examples of what we're trying to do. One, we're running basically a campaign, what we call science-based targets. We've now got 64 of the world's biggest companies, including Walmart, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, now a Chinese steel company, a big Indian chemical company, to commit to what we call science-based targets. So that takes the science of the IPCC, the so-called I think it's RP 2.6 trajectory, which gets us to stay within the 2-degree limit with that 66% chance, and then some of the work of the International Energy Agency, who look at what the implications would be for different sectors to get there. Now we can't. Let's say we have to take 80% of the emissions out by 2050. You can't just apply that same figure to every sector, because different sectors have different process and economic constraints. Simple. Just to illustrate that, if you think of electricity utilities, right? Obviously, they can switch from fossil fuel to renewable over that kind of timescale. So they could completely decarbonise. In fact, we now have some of the first utilities. Enel, which is the second biggest utility in Europe, has committed to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. China Light and Power, one of the biggest coal burners in Asia, based in Hong Kong, has committed to, I think, 90% decarbonisation by 2050. NRG, based in the States, another big incumbent, has committed similarly to 90% reduction. So they can do that, because over that sort of time frame, they can phase out all the coal and switch to renewables. Right? Still a big, courageous commitment, but we're starting to see that. So that sector needs to do kind of 90-95% by 2050, according to the IEA work. Whereas cement, it's much more difficult, because cement has inherent process emissions. The actual process of making cement generates CO2. So it's not just about aluminium. You use a lot of electricity, but that's why a lot of aluminium plants are by dams, because they use hydropower. But so you could decarbonise aluminium. You can't decarbonise completely cement because of some of those inherent processes. So this process of science-based targets is about getting businesses in different sectors to make commitments, which if all businesses did them, would have us on the 2-degree path. And we think that's important, because most countries haven't made a commitment which is ambitious enough to stay within 2 degrees. So when we can say here's 60, and we think it'll be 100 soon, and then over the next 5 years, hopefully many, many more, companies who are adding value to your economy, who are paying tax in your economy, who have made that commitment, it makes it easier for policymakers to be more ambitious, because it takes away that argument that business won't move, because business is already moving, already making that commitment. Another example I already mentioned is the zero deforestation, although I said we're really trying to make sure that it's not just those 27 companies who have gone public, but it's all the ones who are in the Consumer Goods Forum and others there. Another one would be the 100% renewable energies. Now about 42 major global companies have committed to 100% renewable energy. That has the advantage of also sending a strong market signal to people who are thinking of investing in developing renewable energy. And we've just started a partnership with a great little NGO called Share Action, who organise investor engagement with companies. So they have a thing they call their AGM army, who are investors who they send along to AGMs. So they've started going along to AGMs and saying, as an investor as an investor in our company, when is the board planning to make a 100% renewable energy commitment? So it's a very clever bit of using a sort of judo throw, using the machinery of capitalism to to try and raise the ambition, and they've just succeeded in getting Aviva, which is a financial services company, and Land Securities, a major landowner and developer, to make that 100% commitment as a result of their engagement. So you can see when you have these kind of very clear and simple campaigns, they can start to go viral, and we're expecting more and more civil society organisations like Avaz to start putting pressure on companies to join as well. So it'll be company to company, investor to company, and civil society company. And another really important one is a big movement to try and get more countries to put a proper price on carbon. About 2 years ago, it was a very difficult conversation to have. A year ago, we worked with the World Bank to get 1,000 companies to sign a statement saying we support a price on carbon. And this year, we've now gone from 150 companies using an internal price on carbon to 1,000 using or planning to use an internal price on carbon to drive their investment decisions. So we're doing a lot of work with the World Bank and various governments around the world to put meaningful prices on carbon. So like Chile is going to put a $5 a tonne tax on carbon in 2017. That's quite low, but for a middle-income country, that's a great start. And of course, most importantly, perhaps China is now committed to rolling out its pilot carbon cap and trade scheme to be a national scheme in the next couple of years. There's an example of a couple of things that we've been able to do as a coalition. There's something very interesting about the sort of systems change dynamics of a coalition as opposed to individual actors. It feels like as a coalition we now have much more access to the heart of power, being invited to work with the UN system directly, whereas when the UN was looking at this whole ecosystem of like 20, 30 players, it's too difficult to choose one, so they tended not to engage at all. A few months ago, when there was a big G7 heads of state meeting, and one of the things we've been really pushing for in the Paris text is more clarity about the long-term goal to go from stay within 2 degrees to complete decarbonisation or net zero by 2080, something that's more specific, that doesn't require interpretation, but that is, you can sort of nail it, and businesses can understand it, investors can understand it, or everyone can understand it without a degree in Earth Systems Science. This is something I've never done. I've never really worked much with policy in my background, but I've got a great little policy team, 2 people who've been negotiators in the past, and they came to me and said, we think we need to write to the heads of state. And I was asking, like, can we do that? Can we write to heads of state? They're like, yeah, sure. And so through the network, we know people who, who's on the sort of staff of Angela Merkel, who's on the staff of Obama. So we wrote a letter, and we found people that we knew through the whole network. Said, right, Fred, can you make sure that Obama gets to read this and discuss it and be aware that it's going to come up in the G7 meeting? Can you make sure that Merkel is going to get to see it? So that letter we know that letter was tabled and read and discussed, and we had direct feedback from a couple of governments that was part of the conversation, which led to a very strong statement which came out of the G7 meeting that those countries commit to full decarbonisation before the end of the century, which is a radical increase in their overall level of ambition. Another thing we've worked very hard with the World Bank is to create something we call the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. It's a group of about 40 countries and states and about 30 companies who are working together to. And again, it's very interesting when you get finance ministers together talking to each other. That's one conversation. You have chief finance officers talking to another. It's another one. But when you get them together, it's a much more interesting conversation because they have stuff to learn from each other, and they can be really emboldened by realising that. So I was at a meeting in the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals meetings a few weeks ago with 40 finance ministers and 40 CEOs talking about carbon pricing. And it's very interesting. You had CEOs saying to the finance ministers, almost getting desperate, actually saying, you do understand we're asking you to tax us. We're asking you to make our products more expensive. This isn't what we normally do. So there is a real sense of frustration amongst a lot of the business community that government has the tools and needs to find the political courage to implement them, because then you price the externalities for some sectors of the economy, then business and markets can take care of themselves. And the final real big success we had in May, there was a big summit called the Business Climate Summit in Paris, and we were able to run all of the communications work for that. So that instead of the initial plan, which was to have the first session on is climate change real, and the second one on can we do anything about it, to make it much more positive, like start with here's what businesses are already doing, and then with what else needs to be done, rather than go back to some of those old conversations, which have been won a long time ago. One of the most interesting things that came out of that is the coalition that I'm running is all what you might call progressive business NGOs, ones who exist to kind of challenge the status quo and to change the system. In Paris, we were partnering with a lot of mainstream NGOs, the French chemical industry, and most excitingly and most importantly, the International Chamber of Commerce. And one of the challenges of all incumbents who represent the whole economy is they're naturally very conservative, right? So if we're just working with the businesses who've chosen to take bold leadership stance, we don't have to be conservative. We're not held back by them. But if you're the International Chamber of Commerce with over 6 million members, it's much harder to be bold. So one of the most exciting things for us this year was to get the International Chamber of Commerce to co-sign a very bold statement about what businesses want from Paris. A clear long-term goal and a strong price signal. And in fact, a few weeks ago, I should have brought it with me, but we ran a full-page ad in the FT just saying, with some very sneaky wording, saying, organisations representing over, and then 6 million businesses want a strong climate deal in Paris. And again, we had ICC agree to co-sign that, which is something which has never happened before. So we're really excited about that. Right, I want to now give you 6 little examples of business involved in climate leadership and ask you for just quick responses on whether you think this sounds like an olive branch, which those who want bold action on climate change should grasp and celebrate, or whether you think it's a bit dodgy, and why. Okay, so first one, General Mills, one of the world's biggest food companies, $19 billion American food company, recently committed to the point about intention, committed, and their CEO Ken Powell was on the record, to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, not just in their operations, but in their full value chain by 28% by 2025, which matches the US commitment to 26 to 25%. Reasons to be excited about that, reasons to doubt that.
Commitment and 28% are very specific.
Yeah.
So it indicates that they did their research and they know what they cannot do. So that's
Right. Yeah. Good.
28% doesn't sound very much.
Okay.
It's better than nothing.
Okay. 28% doesn't sound very much. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Right, don't know, but good question. Yeah.
Is that discounting their company growth over the next 10 years?
Good question. I can't remember whether it was an absolute or intensity commitment. That's the right sort of question. Yeah.
Because it coincides with US
Yeah.
commitment, to me it indicates that it's more of a compliance measure rather than
Okay. All right.
engagement.
Skeptical. All right. Of course, their supply chain is global, whereas the US commitment is local. But yeah. Any others? Well, I've got 5 more. So.
I was just going to say food production is quite a carbon intensive
Yeah.
industry.
Yeah.
So
I mean, my reading of it is really positive. In particular, they're talking about the whole value chain. That's really tough. That's a really courageous commitment. And the point about intensity, or I'm sure they will have made that. I just can't remember. I think the point about it being 28% actually was quite a clever political signal. They're kind of piling in behind the top end of American. They could have said 26%, but because America said 26 to 28. So, and again, all of these things, proof of the pudding's in the eating. The great thing is because that's clear public commitment, they can then be held accountable. So in 3 years' time, we can all ask the question, are they on track? Okay, next one, Citibank, one of the world's biggest banks, commits to $100 billion of climate-related finance transactions in the next 10 years. Very good because?
Because people like the World Bank rely a lot on the private sector as a source of funding for climate change projects. So it's very good that people like Citibanks are already involved in giving signals that they will be.
Right, good. Sorry.
How much percentage from that total?
Right, very good question. Yeah. I don't know, but small, right? 10 billion a year of transactions, very small.
Unrelated investments, potential issues, Japanese clean coal, for example. Japanese investors, climate based.
Good, right, exactly. Good question. Very. That's the right sort of skepticism, I think. Just because these definitions really matter, right? Yeah.
By what you mean climate-based investment.
Yeah, it does. Is it exactly? Is it real new? Is it IPO helping underwrite IPOs? Is it underwriting bonds, or is it direct? Is it direct project loans? Yeah.
Is it for mitigation or adaptation?
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's a very easy target because there's so much investment in this area coming up, so they just have to participate in this kind of transactions and they go.
So, I mean, my general view is it's pretty lame, and it's a very small percentage. Actually, they achieved 23.6 billion in their first year, which kind of, without really trying, shows it wasn't that hard. I'll tell you the other thing which none of you picked up on really is, when these banks make statements about how much they're supporting low carbon investment, I always want to know how much are you still supporting fossil fuel extraction and burning. Because if you're, if it's 100 billion on clean, but you're going to do, $1 trillion on dirty in the same time, it's the transition that's really interesting. So it's not that it's bad in its own right, but I think those are the right kind of questions. Okay, about 3 months ago, the CEOs of the 6 largest European-based oil and gas majors wrote a letter to Christiana Figueras, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, saying they would like to help her and have a conversation about how to implement a global price on carbon. Good, bad, and different. Why?
It has to be a fair price, a good price on carbon, not just fair price on carbon.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, further to that, the concern with your majors is then not having the capex to be able to invest in the product to create a carbon price, because then they could just increase the oil price and then they'd be able to invest capex techniques and working with integration, so it doesn't necessarily help in terms of actually.
Okay. I don't think I don't think oil price would increase a carbon price wouldn't increase their profits necessarily, because
it makes things more expensive, so they would be able to invest in projects more if you guys sort of tap on that price.
okay. I don't follow you, but it's the right sort of question. Like, is it self-serving? Rather than yeah.
I think it's a very strategic move because by implementing themselves into the conversation, they'll be able to influence the
Yeah. Doesn't anyone trust the oil companies?
I think it's a big step in the right direction.
Because
Some of the most powerful companies in the world, they have the most money, and they do need to be involved in this process.
right.
There needs to be a public trust there, and if they're collaborating with each other as competitors,
Yeah.
forward to that, I think that's
Okay.
quite a big thing.
Yeah. So there's,
Being done in the open, behind closed doors.
okay. Yeah.
I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's a letter to start some talks.
Yeah.
So how far the talk's going to go? Are they going to see them through? Are they,
Yeah.
it's not a commitment yet. So
Yeah. So, I mean, my view on this is it's basically bullshit. Is my view. First of all, Christiana Figueras has no authority to negotiate a global price on carbon. She's a secretary of an international multilateral process. So she's the servant of those 196 countries who are not negotiating a global price on carbon. That's not something that's being negotiated in Paris. So it's like, why write to her? Right. Second of all, these are some of the most powerful companies in the world. If they want a conversation about the price on carbon in public, they can have it. Right? They can just start it. Third of all, there's no specifics in there. This is my particular beef. They say, this is the self-serving point, right, is that a price on carbon will be good for them because it would help drive the transition from coal-fired electricity to gas-fired electricity. Well, if it's good for business, why don't you tell people what that price would be so that investors can judge and investors can lobby? People who own you can lobby for that. Second of all, they always talk about CCS as being part of the solutions, but never talk about where the funding's going to come from CCS. So I predict that within the next 5 years, all of the modelers looking at the energy transition will take CCS out of their models because there is no feasible path to funding it at the moment. So it remains a kind of fantasy. That's like nuclear fission, right? The technology of the future and always will be. Finally, they're totally silent on the So that's gas, right? But where does most oil go? Where does most oil go? Cars, right? No mention of the scenario, the 2-degree scenario in which cars are radically electrified. So I mean, for me, it's a very, very weak signal to the wrong person, and it stops them doing what they could do anyway. So I talked about the net zero. Oh, here's another one. Monsanto joined the Climate Smart Agriculture Initiative. Good, bad, indifferent. Why?
What are the initiatives already binding commitments for the companies that are in them?
Right, good question. So my favourite on this one is the Tropical Forest Alliance and the New York Declaration on Forests, two kind of big collaborative things with lots of companies in, but no commitments. So I'm kind of really tired of these collaborative things which don't have any binding commitments. They may be able to get there, but at the moment that would be something I'd be really looking for, yeah.
So what is
Monsanto's a big agrochemical company who do a lot of genetically modified seeds. So they're a sort of bête noire of a lot of civil society organisations who think that they're driving Frankenstein food and farmer suicides. So if that's your narrative, then anything they're touching is bad, right?
Also, climate smart agriculture implies sustainability, and I find it quite funny that an industry that forces small-scale farmers on applying seeds every year and pretends to be climate smart. That is
Okay.
funny.
So interesting the way these things, all of our biases come out. Yeah. No.
But I mean,
That's a very contentious topic about whether hybrid seeds are good or bad for smallholder farmers, right? But I know that's an argument. I don't know enough about it. That's one of the arguments a lot of civil society have that make any seed companies people they wouldn't want to talk to about climate smart agriculture. Yeah.
They have a very powerful lobby trying to get the message out that GMOs and intensive
Yeah.
mechanical farming is the way forward to provide food security and
Yeah.
better climate. But the question is, do we trust that message? Because the UN, they published a report that small-scale organic farming is going to be the way forward. So
Yeah.
which one do we trust?
Yeah.
They think obvious, so
Yeah. There's a real power asymmetry, right? That they have enormous voice and they buy a lot of voice. Yeah.
Just adding to that, Monsanto are very good at greenwashing, so it sounds like another.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But we know what they're going to say once they get.
Sorry.
We know what they're actually going to say once they get.
Yeah, so of course, I mean, it's kind of a trick question because it's a big, complicated initiative, and there's lots of companies involved in it. But Monsanto is the one that triggers most civil society organisations, and it's almost like kills the initiative before it starts because it winds some people up so much. Interestingly, I've been able to sort of broker a conversation between a friend of mine who's very senior in ActionAid's climate policy work and some people in the climate smart agriculture. And there's a very interesting group that's formed in Brazil called the Coalition on Climate, Agriculture and Forests, which is a coalition of many of the leading forest product businesses and civil society. I mean, I think in this sense, Brazil has got much further advanced kind of social technology than we have in Europe or Americas. In Europe and America, we're kind of much more adversarial. We have civil society here and business there. So that's a very interesting thing. And actually, a part of that conversation has got Monsanto into the conversation about agroforestry and agroecology, because that was one of the ActionAid points, was that none of this is about our solution, which is agroforestry. So, again, I think all the skepticism about Monsanto greenwashing and the asymmetries of power is healthy. But, I think the Brazilian coalition, there may be something which is slightly similar but different from this climate smart agriculture. I'll stop there because it's 5:02. All right, let me just sum up. So PwC just published a really good summary of the INDCs. You could argue with the methodology because but it's all transparent. So, but some of the key numbers in the between 2000 and 2014, we've decarbonized, or we've reduced the carbon intensity of the global economy by 1.4% per year. Right, historically, GDP and carbon emissions have been pretty much in lockstep, so that's starting to decouple. Last year, it was 2.7% a year, and in the UK, it was over 10% decoupling. Big switch, healthy economic growth and a big switch from coal to gas. But in order to stay on a 2-degree trajectory, we need to be reducing the intensity of our global economy at 6.3% per year. So business as usual, we're on a 4% world. That's been very well written about by many people, including the World Bank in their Turn Down the Heat report, which is pretty bad. If we think the refugee crisis in Europe is bad now, then fast forward 20 years in a 4-degree world and we'll have tens or hundreds of millions of climate refugees. And that's actually something that a lot of military strategists see as one of the biggest global security threats. So we definitely don't want to go there. The current INDCs add up. Various people say they get us to, depending on how you extrapolate, between 2.7 and 3.5 degrees. So it's starting to bend down the curve, but not enough. So in summary, I think that we can already say that Paris has been a huge success because we've got 150 countries and we'll get more. We probably won't get all 196 making commitments, and they're all bolder than they've been before. Some of them are amazing, some of them are really disappointing, but they're all made and in public. But it won't be enough because it hasn't bent the curve down to stay on 2 degrees yet. And I believe that the role of these non-state actors, so businesses, cities and states and regions, is going to be crucial, especially in the next 5 years. We don't know yet when the first review of those national plans will be. It could be 2025. I hope it'll be 2020, because 2025 is an age. So my hope is that through the work that we and others are doing to get businesses to be more ambitious, so to go from 65 to 1,000 businesses setting targets in line with the science, and partnering with the states and regions who are doing the same. There's ever 40 states and regions have signed an under 2 MOU, and we're partnering with them to create basically a big political movement of non-state actors who can influence state actors, so that by the time we come to 2020, the national ambition has been increased. One simple example, Europe got a plan to reduce by 40% by 2030, but they said they might raise it to 50% depending on the outcome of Paris. So that would be a pretty good objective in the next 5 years, would be to get Europe to commit to going from 40% to 50%. My pet project in the next year is going to be the death of the internal combustion engine. I think that all the incumbent modelers, and for any of you involved in any of the scientific modelling, there's a real problem of the sort of hegemony of the integrated assessment modelling approach and the IEA as the source of all truth for these models. Those approaches are very, very flawed. It's a classic kind of economist approach where you don't let the reality get in the way of a good theory. You basically model what you can and you leave out what you can't. So famously, those models leave out little things like political influence, and they're all based on marginal abatement costs. I don't think Elon Musk, who's invested billions and made billions in electric vehicles and electric storage, has ever thought about marginal abatement costs. Right? He's just getting on building the future. So we need to think much more about and challenge some of those models. Now we think that the transition is inevitable. Right? We're not totally stupid as a species. We think that it's irresistible because the economics is starting to becoming very strong. We know that companies who've set bold emissions reduction targets are getting higher returns on investment than companies who haven't. That companies who score highest in CDP's rankings provide better overall financial returns to their shareholders. So it's inevitable, it's irresistible, and it's irreversible now. The train's left the station. The only question is, can we do it fast enough? So in order to do that, I think we need to get more discerning about celebrating genuine business commitments and then holding be accountable. We need to remain skeptical about commitments that look like they might have wiggle room left in. And we need to encourage, by whatever means we've got, whether it's through our membership of a VAS or our membership of a pension fund or our friends or parents or our politicians, many, many more businesses to step up and set bold climate targets so that they can then put influence on the nation states so that by 2020 we're on track to 2 degrees. And my hope is that many of you will have a role in helping get us there. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we've got, well, we're on. Yeah, I'm very happy to take questions. I'm not in a rush.
2 questions and then we'll have some wine and stuff.
Oh, yeah, wine. I could have wine now.
Go ahead.
You spoke about the clean finance gap, the concept of trillions, not billions.
Yes.
I wondered about your assessment on mechanisms, prospects for mechanisms like the green climate fund, and other ways to kind of leverage. Governments are used to 100 billion.
Yeah.
Eventually now to government, a certain amount has got businesses
Yeah.
to represent.
Yeah.
How can governments go about leveraging that finance in a more efficient way?
It's a really good question. I mean, several ways, right? One is through using their own public finance to lower the risk on some of the transactions, which then makes them bankable for private finance, right? And interestingly, working quite a lot with the World Bank, that's not, funnily enough, that's not really been a part of their mainstream thinking. So the World Bank, for example, are thinking a lot more about that now, how they can take the, I think, 29 billion a year that they've now committed and leverage that to be 10 or 20x that. So that's one way. Another way is through helping develop markets. So, the green bonds market's been one that's starting to grow really nicely. The Chinese government's had a huge role in that and are going to grow that massively. That's basically where you take bonds, which is a debt which a company sells. So people can buy company debt, but you label it as green so that you know that the proceeds of that bond are going to go to energy efficiency or renewable energy, or there's a whole category. There's a great organisation called the Climate Bonds Initiative, led by a great social entrepreneur called Sean Kidney, who are leading that work. And I think the Chinese will lead a lot of that. So businesses and the development banks can play a huge role in sort of seeding that and testing and proving the concept. The other really important thing, and I haven't mentioned it, is the sort of the role of regulatory bodies. So Mark Carney at the Bank of England has recently made some very bold statements around the systemic risk of stranded assets. And the London Stock Exchange has a disproportionate amount of fossil fuel companies. So if they're massively devalued, that has a much bigger impact on the City of London than on other stock exchanges. So he's been quite brave, I think, in taking it on. He's been asked by the regulators to look at that. The French government have introduced a mandatory transparency law for all asset owners. So anyone who's running someone's pension fund now has to publish the carbon footprint of that and explain how they're managing the risk. I think the Swedish will follow soon. I didn't talk about investments much, but there's some great stuff happening in some of the leading pension funds around active engagement and around strategic reallocation of capital away from high carbon to low carbon. I think that's going to be where the real action is. And most of the noise is around divestment, which is a really important kind of bit of activist movement to open up the space. But the real action is going to be with big asset managers responding to their owners, the pension funds, to move money from high carbon to low carbon to reduce the risk. So regulation to help that happen faster is another way that governments can do it without using their money, but using their... And there are other things. I think the French government owns 33% of GDF Suez, who've just renamed to Engie, one of the big French utilities, and they've just told them they're not going to allow them to invest any more in coal. They've got 33 coal-fired power stations. So, so there's lots of things that governments can do as well as using the money that they do invest wisely.
Okay, I think that's the thing is for people asking questions over drinks.
Yeah.
Do not stand up very longer. We could just thank Nigel for coming in and giving us such a
All right. Thank you.